1842. Um, he does graduate from Harvard in 1837. And I'm going to give you a quote. And this was his quote in 1840. What they do is they ask for a $5 payment for their sheepskin so you can hang it on the wall. And his response, both written and spoken, was, "Let every sheep keep their own skin." He wanted nothing to do with it. And since at that point, he really broke his relationship with the university. So in 1840, he writes and publishes The Service. And that year, he's writing for the Dial, he's journaling, he's running a school with his brother, he's taking care of his youngest sister, Sophia, and he's thinking about the essence of what he called the essence of being. So April 18th, 1841, he moves into the Emerson house, Ralph Waldo Emerson's house, and becomes tutor to his children, editorial assistant to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was at the time the editor of the Dial, repairman, and groundskeeper. And he spent that whole year still doing all of those other things. And still thinking about philosophy, still thinking about what his life means. So in 1842, he writes A Walk to Wachusett. Now, Wachusett is a mountain in the Berkshire Range. And he writes and publishes that. And he's having a hard time staying in one spot. He's doing a lot of stuff, but he doesn't want to be where he is. So anyways, his brother John Jr. dies, who's partners with him with this school, dies of tetanus, and he dies because he had cut himself while shaving. And this was a really strong impact on him, the loss of his brother. And at that point in time, he closes Concord Academy. And he joins the family's pencil company. And he's there for life. And he's not there as a worker. He's there as a creative innovator. And I'll explain that to you in a little bit. So in 1843, he writes and publishes Paradise to be Regained. He writes and publishes The Landlord. And then moves to Staten Island to the home of William Emerson, who is the uncle of Ralph Waldo. And he does that for a few months. And while he's there, he meets the leading intellectual of the United States at the time, Horace Greeley. And Horace says, you need to find your own. Because he's scattered. He's doing all kinds of different things. And his father wants him to do one thing. And his mother wants him to join the family's business. And all of his friends are saying, you can do whatever you want to do, but you have to do something. So in 1843, he rejoins Dunbar Pencil. And at the time, there were still basically Indian rights issues going on in Massachusetts. And they held all of the graphite on their lands. And they were no longer going to share their graphite with the pencil manufacturers. So they figure out another way of doing this whole pencil thing. So he invented a new kind of pencil, which is today the number 2 pencil, which is not all graphite. And it actually comes from a liquid that's turned into a solid. I don't know the science behind it. I'm not a chemist. And the other thing he does is he says, since this is a liquid, why don't we start doing presses, printing presses? And how about pressing our own newspaper? And so he does. Now, meantime, he doesn't have any money. Okay, figuring all this out. He's got not a nickel to rub together. He's constantly broke. And it's not because of, like our other writers that we spoke of who were out drinking and whoring. He wasn't doing any of that. You know, he would have occasional cigarette or a cigar, and that would be it. That was about as much fun as he would have. So in 1844, he writes and publishes his biography of Sir Walter Raleigh, and writes and publishes The Herald of Freedom. And he and his best friend Edward Hoare are hanging out. Now this is a childhood friend and an actual cousin of his. They go out and they're hanging out in Walden Woods, and they accidentally set fire to 30 acres. And now he's marked as a troublemaker with the local authorities. And he and Edward spend a little time hiding away. But they help, put the fire out as well. And he called this the most restless period in his life. And his quote is, I want solitude to write. Where can I find it? Maine, New Hampshire, the Cape? And he continually questioned his reasoning for staying in Concord. So in 1845, he and Ellery Channing were in a conversation, and Ellery Channing said this: Go out upon that and build yourself a hut, and there begins the grand process of devouring yourself alive. I see no other alternative, no other hope for you. And this is where he blooms into the idea of moving to Walden. And he embarks on a 2-year, 2-month, 2-day, 2-hour trip in Walden. And so that was in May when he finally made his decision. And by July, he moves into a small self-built house on Emerson-owned property. And by 1846, he writes and publishes Wendell Phillips' Before Concord Lyceum. He begins to write Walden. He begins to write the poems of nature. He begins the letters to his sister. And then by July, he's, at this point in time, he has 2 friends who are he has one friend and an aunt who are providing him meals and writing materials, because he doesn't want to leave Walden. But he does leave Walden because he runs out of supplies, and his Aunt Louise is not around to help him out. So he's in town, and this is on July 24th or 25th, and he runs into a local tax collector by the name of Sam Staples. And Sam Staples was noted historically as the most aggressive tax collector in the history of Massachusetts. And you already know that he's not big on tax collector. And Anyway, so Sam stops him, knows who he is, and says, "Look, you owe 6 years of delinquent poll tax." And he basically says, "Okay, so what?" And the reason why he refuses to pay the poll tax is because he's fundamentally against the Mexican-American War. And he's fundamentally against slavery. And he's fundamentally against American expansion west. He says, "Why do I have to pay for these things that I don't want?" So he's planning on spending 6 months in jail, because that's the term. Well, anyways, he spends a night. And his aunt, Louise, ends up paying the fine, and essentially against his wishes. And he did protest. I don't want to be out of here. And this was also a really strong impact on him. This is where he begins to write The Nature of Man and Philosophy. You know, why and how we can exist or coexist together. So in August of 1826, he then briefly leaves Walden to make a trip to Maine. And he begins a couple of he writes the first part of Maine Woods, and he begins Reform and Reformers. And so in 1847, again September 6th, let's see. So he stays in Maine for about 3 weeks, and then he returns back to Walden. And in 1847, September 6th, he leaves briefly to help Ralph Waldo Emerson's wife. Ralph is in Europe on an extended trip, and he's, at this particular point in time, was supposed to be serving as minister to France, but he denied the post. And Lydia is alone with all of the Emerson children, and so Thoreau stays. And while he's there, he writes and publishes Thomas Carlyle and his works. All biographical pieces. He's a historian. So in 1848, he finally publishes Reform and the Reformers. And what is that about, Reform and the Reformers? Reform is we have to reform the whole entire system. There's something wrong with it. The Constitution's not the issue. It's the body politique that's the problem. There's some way around it. And he was basically talking about campaign reform. And the reformers, there were lists and lists of them at the time. So, while he's doing this, in 1848, he decides that he's going to start lecturing on the rights and duties of the individual in relation to government. And that piece essentially turns into what is today called civil disobedience. But it was originally a lecture piece, and he went all over the lecture circuit, all throughout New England, Providence, even into New York, and he basically lectured on the rights and duties. And at the same time, he decides to rewrite the lecture and revise it into essays, and it's called The Resistance to Civil Government. Now that's the original title for civil disobedience, and he threw that title away. He didn't like it. And in July of that year, he moves out of Emerson's house and moves into Asa Gray's house on Belknap Street. Asa Gray was a friend of Charles Darwin, the greatest American supporter of Darwinian theory. Probably was the only guy in the Massachusetts area that was so heavy on Darwin. And at this time, he begins to read Alexander von Humboldt, Charles Darwin on the origin of species, and he begins to recognize there's a lot more out there than what's just in Walden. There's a bigger world. So in 1849, he writes a Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, and that's essentially talking about everything that he steps into. the fish that he meets along the way, his narrative. And he's in a canoe. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Concord and the Merrimack, but they're long rivers. Okay, they go through the entire state of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. Anyhow, so that same year, Civil Disobedience is published. No publishing house wanted to touch it. So he bumps into the second wealthiest woman in the country by the name of Elizabeth Peabody, and he says, "You like what I have to say, you've got the dough, you publish my stuff." And she says, "Absolutely." So this is where he's introduced, during this period of time, he's introduced to Indian spiritual thought. What I mean by Indian spiritual thought, I'm talking about India. And he participates in a diet of rice, and he continues that to the day he dies. I can't stand rice. Yoga, the understanding of the Krishna, flute playing, dancing, which is something he never did. Not much on the whole dance thing. And reading their religious text. And this also in 1849, his sister, Helen Louisa, his oldest sister, who is a devout abolitionist, a writer in her own right, an amazing woman, dies of tuberculosis. So anyways, that leaves us at 1850. We've got a lot of other things to go along, and I'll be back for part 3.